The last battle for the Third Reich. The defense of Berlin in 1945 was not simply the last stand of the Third Reich, but the culminating expression of a regime that, faced with annihilation, opted for political and military suicide rather than a rational surrender. Berlin was not of decisive strategic importance at that time. The Eastern Front had already been breached. The Western Allies were advancing from the west, and Germany's military maneuverability was virtually extinguished. However, for Adolf Hitler, the defense of every city was a matter of principle, and no city represented the regime with greater symbolism than the Reich capital. From a strictly military perspective, Berlin's defense was doomed long before the fighting began. Logistics lines were collapsed, resources were insufficient, and the units assigned to the defense were a heterogeneous mix of replacement soldiers, improvised militiamen, Hitler Youth teenagers, and World War I veterans. Adding to this mishmash were the disorganized remnants of shattered divisions at the front, along with scattered elements of the Waffen, SS, and the Volkssturm, a people's militia armed with what little remained. Despite all this, the city was declared a fortified stronghold in early February 1945, and express orders were issued to hold out to the last man, with no possibility of surrender. The structural chaos that dominated the defense of Berlin was no accident. It was the direct result of the command system established by Hitler himself, where operational decisions were monopolized by him and his orders were issued with little knowledge of the terrain, the enemy, and the actual conditions. Middle management was displaced or ignored, withdrawal plans were prohibited, and the few rational initiatives, such as the proposal by Generaloberst Heinrich's plan to evacuate the city to avoid a bloodbath, were systematically sabotaged from the highest echelons of power. In this context, the Battle for Berlin must be understood not as a classic military operation, but as the final act of a decaying totalitarian state. The city was sacrificed for ideological, symbolic, and personal reasons. For Hitler, allowing Berlin to fall without a fight meant admitting the utter failure of National Socialism. Therefore, he fanatically ordered its defense, dragging thousands of civilians and soldiers with him to unnecessary death. The battle that took place between April and May 1945 was not a defense in the strictest sense, but a collective immolation under the banner of a regime that no longer sought to survive, but to collapse with a roar. The Army High Command offered no effective resistance to this desperate decision to defend the capital on its own doorstep. It was merely a tool for carrying out the Führer's orders. The possibility of formulating an alternative, more rational plan was eliminated from the moment Guderian was dismissed and replaced by more compliant and less proactive commanders. Army Group Vistula, for its part, was the only organization that attempted to implement a coherent strategic approach. Its commander, Generaloberst Heinrichi, acted with military sense and responsibility for the fate of his troops and the population. However, his proposals and measures were repeatedly thwarted by direct orders from Hitler, who intervened without coordination, changing fundamental decisions at the last minute, often without notifying his subordinate commanders. Even though Army Group Vistula attempted to organize the withdrawal of its forces westward, seeking capture by the Anglo-Americans rather than being taken prisoner by the Soviets, these measures were belated and partial. In the chaos of the last days of April, with communications broken, orders contradictory, and the general collapse of the front, no strategic operation could have a decisive effect. The defense of Berlin was not the product of a realistic strategy, but the ultimate expression of the Führer's fanaticism, his disconnection from reality, and the paralysis of the military command under an authoritarian and delusional regime in its final throes. Until 1st February 1945, the military needs of the city of Berlin were the direct responsibility of the Wehrmacht Area Command, a structure subordinate to the 3rd Army Corps headquarters on replacement duty, which in turn reported to the replacement army. The latter was not subordinate to the Army High Command, OKH, but directly to the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW. Curiously, the Supreme Commander of the replacement army was not an Heer officer, but the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. When Berlin was declared a fortified stronghold in early February 1945, probably on February 1st itself, the Third Corps headquarters, while retaining its previous functions, was formally redesignated as the office of the Commander of the Berlin Defense Area. The general then in command was Infantry General von Kurzfleisch. Shortly thereafter, at the beginning of the same month, he was replaced by General-Lieutenant Ritter von Hauenschild. Under the command of his successor, General-Lieutenant Reimann, the position of Commander of the Berlin Defense Area was separated from the Third Corps Command. At a critical juncture, on April 19, 1945, just as the Oder front was crumbling and Soviet troops were advancing at full speed toward the capital, the commander of the Berlin Defense Area was formally subordinated to Army Group Vistula. However, this arrangement lasted only 3 days. On April 22nd, it was completely revoked, and Berlin was placed under the direct control of the Army High Command. On that same day, General Reimann was relieved of his post in charge of the defense of Berlin and appointed commander of the so-called Spree Group, Armeegruppe. Spree, an improvised force that in reality consisted of only a reduced and much weakened division. It was initially replaced by Colonel Keitel, who had until then been in charge of National Socialist ideological training within the army. The next day, April 23rd, the command changed again. The commanding general of the 56th Panzer Corps, General of the Artillery Helmut Weidling, was summoned to the Führer's bunker under threat of execution, as it was thought he would be shot for having allowed his troops to retreat in the face of the Soviet advance. However, Weidling impressed Hitler favorably during the audience, leading to his immediate appointment as the new commander of Berlin's defense. He also retained simultaneous command of his Panzer Corps. Thus, in less than 3 months, Berlin had 5 different commanders, 3 of whom were appointed within the space of just 48 hours. Before this frantic succession of commands, the Berlin area headquarters, subordinate to the replacement army, had been primarily responsible for administrative, logistical, and internal security tasks, guarding bridges, supply depots, controlling foreign workers, of whom there were numerous in the city, and clearing streets after aerial bombing raids. Its participation in the active defense of the city was therefore marginal. As urban combat approached, its most important function became the capture of straggling soldiers, a task later assumed by the Party Security Service, SD. While General von Hauenschild was in command, his dual role became an operational difficulty. As commander of the Third Corps headquarters and Wehrkreis III, he had to send reinforcements to the Oder front. But as the person responsible for the defense of Berlin, he needed to maintain troops in the city. These conflicting responsibilities led to urban defense being neglected. After falling ill in early March, von Hauenschild was replaced by General-Lieutenant Reimann, decided to separate the 2 commands. He remained in charge of Berlin's defense, while General of the Engineers Kunze was appointed to command the Third Corps. Thus, the headquarters was removed from any direct responsibility for the defense of the capital, and its personnel were evacuated shortly before the siege began. Reimann organized his own general staff, headed by General Staff Colonel, GSC, Riefer. Preparations for defense continued vigorously, but material limitations were so great that only improvised and inconsistent measures could be taken. The city was divided into 8 defensive sectors, designated A to H, radiating out from the urban bypass railway line. Each was assigned a mid-ranking officer or general with authority equivalent to that of a division commander. However, due to a shortage of experienced officers, they had to resort to commands from anti-aircraft artillery units or the territorial army, with no actual combat experience. The same was true of the sub-sector commanders. On April 23rd, just as Soviet forces were about to penetrate the heart of the city, Reimann was dismissed and sent to command the aforementioned Spree grouping. The decision was reportedly prompted by Goebbels himself, who had initially supported Reimann but then abruptly changed his mind. Generaloberst Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula and Reimann's superior at the time, attempted to prevent the relief, considering it absurd to change command at such a critical moment. However, his order was ignored, and Rehmann had to withdraw with part of his troops toward Potsdam, where he was surrounded. Kunze was initially considered, but he declined for health reasons. An older young man was then considered, but was rejected due to his inexperience and age. Finally, Colonel Cather was appointed, who was swiftly promoted to General Major and then to General Lieutenant, although these promotions were only valid for the duration of his new position. This accelerated and circumstantial promotion was unprecedented in the German army, but it proved futile. Cather only held command for 2 days. On the evening of 23rd April, General Weidling was summoned to the Führerbunker under threat of execution. Rather than be punished, Hitler gave him overall responsibility for the defense. Weidling partially reorganized Reimann's staff, retaining his own chief of staff, Colonel von Duffing, and keeping Riefeier as deputy chief. Colonel Wöhrlemann assumed control of all artillery in the city, subordinating Lieutenant Colonel Plathow, who until then had held that role in the defense area. In an attempt to consolidate the command structure, Weidling grouped the 8 defense sectors into 4, each under the command of a division commander with frontline combat experience. This integration sought to combine the existing local structure with more solid operational leadership. However, tensions arose. One notable case was that of Lieutenant Colonel Behrenfänger, recently promoted to General Major, who refused to subordinate himself to an external divisional commander. These internal frictions, combined with the urgency with which the new Panzer Corps units had to be employed, led to constant alterations in the defensive scheme, which in practice never fully functioned as planned. Initially, the defense command post was established in a corps building on Hohenzollern-Damm. However, when Russian troops approached that area on April 25th, it had to be moved to the Bendler bunker. Nevertheless, General Weidling spent most of his time in the Reich Chancellery, from where he directed the final fighting. Meanwhile, Berlin was only about 70 kilometers behind Army Group Vistula's main line of resistance, whose position extended from the confluence of the Neisse and Oder rivers to the Baltic, roughly following the course of the Oder. The capital's proximity to the front made it clear that collapse was imminent and that a sustained defense was impossible. Although the city of Berlin was located just 70 kilometers behind Army Group Vistula's main front, the possibility of organizing an effective defense from that operational level was practically non-existent. The front held by this army group extended along a line that ran from the confluence of the Neisse and Oder rivers to the shores of the Baltic Sea, in a strip that generally followed the course of the Oder River. This extension of the front, covering hundreds of kilometers, represented an enormous logistical and military challenge, especially considering the increasingly precarious conditions in which the Wehrmacht found itself during the final months of the war. Army Group Vistula, under the command of Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrici, was in a state of near exhaustion. Available reserves were minimal, rail and supply transport had collapsed, and communications were constantly disrupted by bombing and the general chaos of the collapsing front lines. Furthermore, the constant political pressure exerted by Hitler from his central headquarters prevented any form of rational planning or strategic retreat. Despite his efforts to coordinate a mobile defense and avoid pointless bloodshed in the capital, Heinrici was consistently blocked from making his most prudent decisions. The army group had not originally been conceived to defend the city of Berlin. Its mission was to hold the Oder line as long as possible and, in the event of collapse, retreat westward to avoid being annihilated by the Red Army. But this doctrine directly conflicted with the orders issued from Hitler's bunker, which demanded not only the total defense of Berlin, but also suicidal counteroffensives toward the city by units already on the verge of collapse. To further aggravate the situation, the forces available for an effective defense inside Berlin were heterogeneous, poorly armed, and lacked tactical cohesion. Regular troops, Volkssturm battalions, Hitler Youth units, improvised armed workers groups, remnants of armored divisions and SAS elements shared sectors with no clear chain of command, effective communications, or real coordination. The arrival of the 56th Panzer Corps under Weidling provided some cohesion, But it was too little too late to alter the inevitable course of the Soviet encirclement. The beginning of the end. From an operational perspective, the defense of Berlin was never a realistic military possibility. Instead, it was a symbolic and fanatical construct driven from the center of power of the Third Reich. The fact that Hitler, Goebbels, and other members of the power circle chose to remain in the city until the end reflects not a strategic calculation, but a mixture of denial, messianic delusion, and a desire to drag the German people into the abyss along with their regime. Coordination between the various levels of command, from Army Group Vistula to the urban defense authorities, was marked by contradictions, political interference, unilateral decisions, and improvisation. In reality, the battle for Berlin was a succession of irrational decisions, overlapping commands, hasty changes, and fragmented, organized resistance, the only result of which was an extremely high human cost to a civilian population that lacked any effective protection. Civilians were under the authority of the Wehrmacht Area Command. This command was subordinate to the Third Army Corps' alternate headquarters, and therefore to the replacement army, which in turn was not answerable to the Army High Command, OKH, but to the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW. Its functions were primarily administrative, logistical control of the garrison, guarding bridges, supply depots, and foreign workers, whose numbers were considerable in Berlin, as well as clearing debris after bombing raids and clearing communication routes. Although Berlin was declared a fortified stronghold, it was not this command that was in charge of organizing the defense, but rather the deputy headquarters of the Third Corps, which assumed the role of Greater Berlin Defense Area Command. The Wehrmacht Area Command retained its previous functions, with a particular emphasis on the capture of stragglers. However, this task was taken over during the battle by the Party Security Service, SD, further reducing its defensive role. This body had the dual responsibility of coordinating both the military region, Wehrkreis III, and the Berlin Defense Area. After the collapse of the Vistula front, the overall commander, initially General of the Infantry von Kurzfleisch, organized a defensive position behind the Oder, which was immediately overrun. Von Kurzfleisch was dismissed in early February due to the deterioration of his relations with the Gauleiter of Berlin, Joseph Goebbels, whose interference in military matters had caused friction. He was succeeded by Generalleutnant Ritter von Hauenschild, who was relieved of responsibility for the Oder front by Army Group Vistula, began defensive preparations for the city. However, his dual role proved detrimental. As head of the Wehrkreis, he was to send reinforcements to the front, but as commander of the defense area, he was to retain troops in Berlin. This conflict of interest relegated the city's defense to a secondary priority. When von Hauenschild fell ill in early March, he was replaced by Generalleutnant Reimann, who formally separated the two commands. He assumed command of the defense area, while Engineer General Kunze took command of the Third Corps. The headquarters was evacuated shortly before the city was surrounded. Generalleutnant Reimann organized his own general staff, headed by Colonel Reffior. Progress was made in defensive organization, although the measures were necessarily improvised due to the scarcity of resources. The city was divided into 8 sectors, A to H, organized from the urban railway ring road outwards. Each sector was assigned to an officer with the authority of a division commander, but in most cases these were anti-aircraft artillery or territorial army officers with no actual combat experience. On April 23rd, just as Soviet troops reached the approaches to the city, Reimann was removed from his post and assigned to command the Armeegruppe Spree, a combat group that in practice consisted of a reduced division. His dismissal was allegedly prompted by Goebbels, who had lost confidence in him. The Generaloberst Heinrici attempted to overturn the decision, arguing that command should not be changed in the midst of imminent danger. However, his orders were ignored. That same day, Colonel Cather was appointed the new defense commander. He was promoted first to General Major and then to General Lieutenant, although both promotions were provisional and limited to the duration of the position. His tenure was brief. He served only 2 days. That night, Artillery General Weidling, commanding the LVI Panzer Corps, was summoned to Hitler's bunker under threat of execution. However, his briefing convinced the Führer, who appointed him commander of the defense area, also keeping him in command of his corps. He thus became the 5th defense commander in less than 3 months and the 3rd in just 2 days. Weidling used part of Reimann's staff and kept Colonel Riefuhr as deputy commander. Colonel Wöhlemann assumed overall command of the artillery in the city. To improve coordination, Weidling subordinated 2 sectors to each of his 4 division commanders, thus integrating local structures with experienced commanders. However, this reform met with resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Behrenfänger, recently promoted to General Major, refused to be subordinated to an outside commander. These conflicts, coupled with the urgency of combat, prevented the new structure from stabilizing. The main command post was moved from the Hohenzollern-Damm to the Bendler bunker on April 25th as the Russians approached. However, Weidling operated primarily from the Reich Chancellery, since, in the event of a breakthrough in the Oder front, Berlin was to be immediately incorporated into the group's area of operations. It would have been logical to place it under his command from the outset. Although this was not done, the group expected such subordination to be formalized when the critical moment arose and had requested to be briefed by Reimann or his chief of staff on all defensive preparations. The group also attempted to avoid demolitions that would exacerbate civilian suffering. General Heinrici reserved the right to order such blasting only if his authority over the city was formalized. On April 19th, following the breakthrough of the Oder front, Berlin officially became part of Army Group Vistula. An attempt was then made to implement the plan to evacuate all security troops still capable of combat, but it was only partially successful. The group's headquarters, located near Prenzlau, could not effectively manage Berlin's affairs, so the defense was transferred to the Ninth Army. However, its commander, General of Infantry Busse, rightly refused, given that his army was still fighting on the Oder. Thus, the order was rescinded, and command of Berlin returned to the group. One possible solution would have been to create a new army command in Berlin, under Steiner, for example, subordinating the defense of Berlin to it, the Armeegruppe Spree to the south, troops of the LVI Panzerkorps to the east, and the security forces in Eberswalde-Oranienburg. However, this required preparation that had not been made and conflicted with the plan to evacuate the city without fighting. The subordination ended on April 22nd, when Hitler assumed direct command. During the brief time that the group commanded the defense, Hitler intervened without respecting the chain of command, as demonstrated by the dismissal of Reimann, which was done without consulting the group. The Armeegruppe Spree, which was charged with halting the Soviet advance from the south, was not dependent on the group or the Ninth Army, but directly on the Army High Command. The most serious interference occurred on April 23rd, when Hitler ordered the 56th Panzer Corps, subordinate to the Ninth Army, to enter Berlin without informing either the army or the group. This decision had 3 effects. Berlin received reinforcements capable of temporarily resisting. The Ninth Army was surrounded from the north and south. The group disintegrated, and the Soviets were able to advance westward north of Berlin. Within the 56th Panzer Corps itself, conflicts arose. The SS division Nordland attempted to break away and join Steiner's division, but Hitler ordered it to join Berlin directly, ignoring the chain of command. The division's commander was briefly dismissed. The OKH never made a clear decision on who should lead the defense of Berlin. Instead of placing it under the control of the army group or assuming it directly, it left everything to the Führer's instructions. This created an untenable situation. The area commander couldn't consult Hitler on every detail and was left in limbo. Subordination to the army group would have been effective if Hitler and the OKH had not continued to issue orders outside the command channel. Eventually, with the exclusion of the group, Berlin came completely under the direct control of the Führer, who became its nominal and effective commander. On April 23rd and 24th, with a few exceptions, the OKH and OKW left Berlin. On the 25th, they merged into a single agency. From then on behalf of Hitler, Keitel and Jodl pressured the 12th Army and the Vistula Group to launch relief attacks. The contradictions that emerged led to Heinrich's dismissal on April 29th, a measure that could no longer change the fate of the capital. Although Berlin was to be immediately incorporated into Army Group Vistula's zone of operations in the event of a breakthrough, this subordination was not specified from the outset. However, the group expected this to happen when the critical moment came and had requested to be informed by Reimann or his chief of staff about the progress of all defensive measures. It also sought to prevent planned demolitions, aiming to avoid devastating consequences for the civilian population. General Heinrich had reserved the exclusive right to authorize such demolitions should the city's defense formally come under his control. Finally, on April 19th, after the collapse of the Oder front east of Berlin, the defense area was placed under the authority of the Army Group. An immediate attempt was made to execute the plan to evacuate all security units still fit for combat from the city and integrate them into the outer defensive positions. However, this operation was only partially successful, since the Army Group could not effectively handle the enormous flow of decisions and orders related to Berlin from its command post near Prenzlau. It temporarily transferred control of urban defense to the 9th Army, fighting east of the city. But its commander, General der Infanterie Theodor Busse, refused this responsibility on valid grounds. In the heat of the battle, and with his center and right wings still committed to the Oder, he could not handle urban defense. As a result, the Army Group reversed the transfer and retained direct command over Berlin. One possible solution to this command dilemma might have been the creation of a new army command based in Berlin, possibly under SS Obergruppenführer Steiner, to coordinate all forces south of the city, the Armeegruppe Spree, to the east, the advance troops and the LVI Panzer Corps, and to the northeast, the security units in the Eberswald-Oranienburg area. However, this structure required prior planning that did not exist, and it also contradicted the strategic objective of evacuating the city without combat. Berlin's subordination to Army Group Vistula was short-lived. On April 22nd, Hitler personally assumed command of the defense. Even during the few days when the group had control, Hitler directly interfered in the chain of command. The most obvious example was the dismissal of Reimann, carried out without consulting the group and despite its objections. The Armeegruppe Spree, charged with halting the Soviet advance from the south via Lübbenau, did not depend on the Army Group, the 9th Army, or the defense of Berlin, but directly on the Army High Command. The most serious interference occurred on April 23rd when Hitler ordered, without warning, the transfer of the 56th Panzer Corps, subordinated to the 9th Army, directly to Berlin. This action had three immediate consequences. Berlin received troops that allowed its resistance to be prolonged. The 9th Army was surrounded from the north and south, precipitating its encirclement, and Army Group Vistula lost organizational coherence, allowing the Soviets to advance westward, north of the capital. Even within the 56th Panzer Corps, conflicts of authority arose. The SS Division Nordland attempted to detach itself from its corps to establish contact with Steiner's security units, but Hitler ordered it to be taken directly to Berlin without informing the corps command. This interference resulted in the temporary relief of the division commander. The Army High Command never clearly resolved who should assume command of the defense of Berlin. From the outset, the capital should have been under the control of Army Group Vistula, or the High Command itself. Instead, orders came exclusively from Hitler, who made decisions personally without any clear chain of command. The area commanders were left hanging in the air, with no real possibility of consulting the Führer on every operational matter. Complete subordination to Army Group Vistula would have clarified the situation, provided that Hitler and the High Command stopped issuing parallel orders outside institutional channels. However, after the group's exclusion, Berlin's direct subordination to Hitler became clear. From then on, the Führer was the effective and symbolic commander of the city's defense. On April 23rd and 24th, with few exceptions, both the Army and Wehrmacht high commands withdrew from Berlin. On April 25th, the two structures were unified into a single entity, representing Hitler. Keitel and Jodl then pressured the 12th Army and Army Group Vistula to launch relief attacks toward the city. The internal contradictions this generated led to Heinrich's dismissal on April 29th, although nothing could be done to alter Berlin's fate. The city of Berlin, the last refuge of the Reich, lay practically open to the Red Army's offensive. Only a few natural features offered real resistance to the enemy advance: the Havel Lakes to the west and the Dahme River and the Müggelsee to the southeast. Narrow canals like the Teltow to the south, the Landwehr Canal in the city centre and the Spree River itself were nothing more than minor obstacles, impotent witnesses to what was to come. Only to the northeast did the canals and irrigation fields offer any resistance to the armoured vehicle thrust. Throughout the south, north and much of the east, the German capital lay exposed, unprotected, naked to the storm. A ring of scattered forests surrounded Berlin, some 30 to 50 kilometers from the city centre to the south, east and north. Lakes, rivers and canals crisscrossed the terrain, but they were more like traps than barriers. Instead of stopping the enemy, they slowed down the defenders and exposed them. To the east, this natural belt ran through Königs Wusterhausen, Erkner and Tiefensee to the former channel of the Oder near Baden-Württemberg, Freienwalde. The roads and paths that wove through the Berlin landscape were designed for a nation that no longer existed, a tight and effective peacetime network, now transformed into death rows. The terrain was mostly sandy, flat, easily traversable by Soviet armored divisions. The only visual respites for the defenders were small patches of woods and sprawling parks, which provided cover for approaches to the city. Within the capital, the accumulated destruction of years of bombing had transformed neighborhoods into fields of ruins, where every burned-out building, every broken wall became a parapet, a refuge, and a tomb. The rubble and the torn-up streets offered natural positions for a desperate urban defense. And yet, despite these conditions, there was no solid strategic planning. The defense was a belated, improvised reaction, born of the stubbornness of a dying regime that no longer thought of victory, but of dragging its people down with it. Plans for a slow death. The initial plan was to contain the enemy at the Oder. All available forces were sent there, leaving the eastern forest unprepared and untrooped. Even so, an attempt was made to fortify the line from Erkner to Tiefensee as a secondary position against an attack from the east. About 30 kilometers from the center, a ring of obstacles was outlined to delay the Soviet advance. The towns between this ring and the urban perimeter would, in theory, become fortresses of resistance. They were to be fought to the last man. It was a senseless military concept, born of delirium and terror. Neither the layout of the terrain nor the available human resources allowed for such a plan. The main line of defense would be the city's own ring road. Every available geographical feature would be exploited there. But even that line, approximately 100 kilometers in circumference, was impossible to hold. To maintain an effective defense required at least 100 combat divisions, fully manned and trained. Instead, what Berlin had was a shadow of a force. 60,000 members of the Volkssturm, a desperate militia made up of old men and teenagers. A third of them didn't even have weapons. The rest were equipped with obsolete rifles, incompatible foreign parts, and only a few automatic weapons. In total, there were 20 to 30 artillery batteries and some fixed air defense units. It was an improvised, symbolic line, doomed from the start. But the horror didn't end there. The city was to be defended to the last brick, even after the perimeter fell. It was a direct order, fight house by house, street by street, without hope or retreat. The 35-kilometer-long circular urban railway line was considered a last continuous trench. Closer to the center, the area enclosed by the Landwehr Canal and the Spree River would be the core of the final defense. And when even that fell, the last redoubts would be individual buildings. The Reich Chancellery, the Reichstag, the Bendler Block, the air raid shelters. Stone bastions destined to become sepulchres. In charge of the defensive constructions was Colonel Lobeck, Chief of Engineers subordinate to the area commander. The sectors were reinforced by engineering officers and small detachments, responsible for supervising workers, organizing demolitions, and directing the construction of trenches. Only one regular sapper battalion was available, so General Reimann ordered the improvisation of 2 more battalions with hastily trained Volkssturm men. The available human resources were paltry for a city of more than 3 million inhabitants. The maximum number of workers mobilized in a single day was 70,000. This already modest number was affected by multiple factors. Factories continued to produce non-stop until the final days. Many areas were remote and inaccessible by train, and vehicle fuel was non-existent. Even the daily transfer of workers from their neighborhoods to the positions to be fortified was a daunting task. In many cases, companies located near the front lines were called in to provide personnel. The only well-equipped contingents were the Tod organization and the National Labor Service. The rest had to work with their own tools. Small batches of shovels and pickaxes were obtained from the Rehhagen-Klausdorf engineering depot. Initially, bulldozers were used to dig trenches and anti-tank ditches, but they soon had to be abandoned due to a lack of fuel. The possibilities of building concrete bunkers were nil. There were almost no mines, no barbed wire, and no explosives in sufficient quantities. The defensive system that was successfully established was a reflection of chaos: shallow trenches, improvised bunkers, anti-tank obstacles in the streets, and trenches dug at key points along the outer ring. Some rear positions were built at the initiative of local party leaders, without coordination or technical support, often without any tactical logic. Many of these fortifications became traps for the defenders themselves. The errors were fatal: obstacles that impeded the passage of friendly units, trenches that were left uncovered, and dugouts without ventilation. The defense of Berlin was not a military operation. It was a slow immolation. It was the final act of a regime that, faced with the inevitability of defeat, chose to sacrifice its greatest city, its people, its history, its architecture, and its dignity, all in the name of a crumbling ideology. Beyond the outer ring, scattered among villages, factories, farms, and railway stations, forward positions were erected. In theory, these positions were meant to delay the enemy, buy time, and temporarily halt the Soviet advance. In practice, they were places of abandonment, improvisation, and collapse. The so-called ring of obstacles was nothing more than a series of barricades erected at crossroads or rural squares, guarded by 30 or 40 Volkssturm men, armed with what little they could muster: a few old rifles, a couple of anti-tank weapons, and a lot of sheer determination. There they dug foxholes, set up palisades, and strung barbed wire wherever they could. But these small garrisons, isolated and without communication with each other, were doomed from the start. There were no heavy weapons, no unified command, no reconnaissance, no up-to-date maps, and no radio contact. In most cases, when the Soviet vanguards arrived, there was no fighting. The Russians simply circled around the obstacles or crushed them without difficulty. Even the forward defensive position, which was to have become the first real line of resistance east of the city, failed without a proper fight. Its natural advantage was the terrain: wooded areas, canals, narrow passes. But the fortifications erected there were sparse, typical of a common field position. Goering had sent a large contingent of Luftwaffe personnel at the beginning of April, but they were soldiers in name only. They were unarmed. They didn't know how to fight on the ground. They didn't understand infantry discipline. They were reinforced with equally inexperienced Volkssturm elements. When the Soviets arrived, they didn't find a defensive line. They found a mass of disorganized men who dissolved at the first contact. On April 21st, a contingent of 30 battalions had been sent from Berlin to this forward position, but fate didn't allow them time. The next day, Soviet columns were already advancing west of that line. They had been overrun without a fight, Führer's delirious orders. When the enemy appeared in front of the forward position, Hitler ordered the 56th Panzer Corps to counterattack. All of his units were concentrated for that objective on both sides of the Berlin-Kustrin Railway. Meanwhile, the Soviets advanced freely to the north. If the Ninth Army had had autonomy, it would probably have used the Panzer Corps to reinforce the defense and hold the line. It would also have been possible to withdraw the Ninth Army's still intact right wing and concentrate it in defense of the left flank, which was fighting under desperate conditions. But logic was no longer welcome in the High Command. From his Berlin command, Riemann could not hold that line with the limited forces he had. The collapse was swift, total, and a reflection of the structural disorder that had taken hold of the military apparatus. Berlin's main line of resistance was located along the city perimeter. A continuous trench marked its course with some double positions to the east and west. In the south, the line followed the northern bank of the Teltow Canal, then passed south of it from Lichterfelde to Johannisthal. To the east, it crossed the outskirts of the Müggelsee and encircled Mahlsdorf, while a second line reinforced it along the Grünau-Herzberg railway. In the north, the defense was based on the irrigated fields bordered Weissensee and Niederschönhausen and continued parallel to the so-called Northern Ditch to the Tegeler Sea. In the west, the line ran along the eastern bank of the Havel and Tegeler Sea, bordered Spandau, Seeburg, Großklinika and Sacro to protect Gatow Airport. A second position followed the eastern edge of the Havel Lakes. Behind this fragile wall, some 20 fixed batteries and unemplaced anti-aircraft artillery attempted to fill the gaps. It was a structure more symbolic than military, where sectors were defended by improvised units, lacking doctrine or adequate weapons. The testimony of Lieutenant von Reuss, commanding a small Volkssturm platoon near the Teltow Canal, starkly exposes this reality. They prepared a trench on the north bank of the canal, with machine gun nests every 500 or 600 meters. The trench crossed marshy terrain, making movement difficult. One of the positions was reinforced with cement slabs built on the grounds of an asbestos factory. They had no supporting artillery. They had only a couple of anti-aircraft guns, a rocket launcher, and a paltry arsenal, a Czech machine gun that jammed after the first shot, and a collection of foreign rifles, including Italian Balilla rifles originally intended for children. Such was the resistance in the sector. On the night of the first engagement, the neighboring platoon withdrew to its barracks and returned the next day. Since the Soviets did not attack in force there, they managed to hold the sector for 2 days. Further east in the Friedrichshagen area, Sergeant Gümpel supervised the construction of trenches and dugouts with civilian workers and local factory workers. 50 men dug a continuous line each day and began building bunkers that were never completed. The position was expected to be defended by 250 men, Volkssturm and replacement battalions. But when the Soviets arrived, the position disintegrated. Only the battalion commander and about 25 men offered resistance. The rest fled or disappeared. Gümpel and his group were only able to regroup a few stragglers. In the north, east of the Tegeler Sea, Major Schwark led a factory protection battalion. His sector was a shallow firing line without mines or barbed wire. The position lay on the so-called Northern Ditch, an insignificant trench more useful as a line of sight than as an actual defense. His men were veterans of the Great War, disciplined but armed only with rifles, grenades, and a few Panzerfausts. The enemy avoided a frontal attack. They advanced by infiltration, mostly at night, taking advantage of the terrain and poor visibility. The line was besieged by Soviet snipers positioned on rooftops in front of and behind the positions. Despite everything, Schwark managed to hold his men together for 3 days. When the encirclement was imminent, they withdrew to a new position in a bakery where he was seriously wounded. Gatow sector. Major Komorowski commanded a mixed battalion of workers and Volkssturm militiamen with no combat experience. They defended a well-constructed trench west of the airfield. In case of collapse, they were to cross the Wannsee in prepared boats to occupy a second line on the opposite bank. They were armed with captured rifles a few machine guns, and limited ammunition. They were supported by an 88mm battery and a platoon of heavy infantry guns, all of which had never fired their pieces. On the night of the first attack, all the Volkssturm men deserted. An attempt was made to replace them with scattered soldiers. Within 2 days, all the defenders were killed or captured. That was the true face of Berlin's defense line. A shallow trench with no tactical depth, manned by disorganized units, poorly armed and unequal in their will to fight. And yet, amid that misery, there were moments of stubborn resistance. Men with no future managed to hold off the Red Army for hours or days, not out of faith, but out of sheer desperation. And yet, wherever the Soviets decided to push hard, the line immediately collapsed. Strangely, the Russians did not always take advantage of the collapse. They halted, reorganized, and advanced cautiously. This allowed other intermediate positions, improvised replacement lines, to prolong a fight that was lost from the start. But when the enemy breached the outer defenses, they encountered the final obstacle: the hardened fighting remnants of the 56th Panzer Corps, which, despite the chaos, used every meter of ground and every meter of trench to hold out until the city was buried under the rubble of its own history. The Berlin Circular Railway, which in peacetime served to connect the outer districts with the heart of the city, was transformed in the final days of the Reich into a sort of trench of steel and rubble. Its strategic value lay in offering the defenders a clear line along which to organize their resistance. However, the harsh terrain prevented the digging of continuous trenches. The fortifications there were minimal, improvised, and consisted of small fighting nests for 3 or 4 men. The streets behind the line should have been fortified as well, but this was left to the goodwill, desperation, and isolated courage of those who still cared to resist. A report by Battalion Commander Heinrich Barth, a member of the Volkssturm, bears direct witness to this disorganization. His unit, composed of 800 poorly equipped men, was to serve as a reserve for another battalion stationed along the railway line. Equipment was scarce, uniforms non-existent. There was no clear authority. The battalion answered both to the district party headquarters and to a local military command. Contradictions in orders were constant. Confusion was the rule. Despite this, fixed and mobile anti-tank barriers were built. Main avenues were blocked with enormous concrete blocks that could be partially opened to allow trams and vehicles to pass during the day. At night, everything was sealed off. Side streets were sealed off with steel and wooden barricades, up to 3 meters high, built on beds of rubble. To cover the avenues, machine guns were placed on the upper floors of buildings. Passages were dug from the basements to the streets to launch Panzerfausts at enemy tanks. Homes were transformed into fortresses. Tunnels were dug to connect basements and allow underground travel. Snipers were stationed on the roofs. Training, of course, was sacrificed in favor of construction. Hardly any motivational talks were given. Shortly before the start of the battle, the battalion received 100 rifles. And when the time came to fight, of the 800 men, only 60 remained at their posts. The rest returned home. Where there was initiative and determination, positions were ingeniously prepared. In other sectors, the city was abandoned to fate. Some men fought fiercely. Others vanished into the fog of fear. The anti-aircraft towers, the gigantic concrete structures built to repel Allied bombing and shelter the civilian population, became in recent days vertical fortresses. The towers at the Zoo, Humboldthain and Friedrichshain, along with the control tower, unarmed, were designed as impenetrable bunkers, self-sufficient with water, electricity, food and ammunition. They were authentic modern fortresses, capable of housing 15,000 people plus their garrisons. When the ground battle reached Berlin, they were filled with wounded deserters, wandering civilians, women and children. They far exceeded their capacity. There, amid the roar of cannon fire and the echoes of distant explosions, humanity huddled like a flock on the edge of the abyss. No one had thought of using them for ground combat. They had no embrasures, no defenses at their entrances. The platforms were designed to fire skyward, not down at the streets. The blind spots were as great as the lost hopes. And yet they held. Anti-aircraft guns pointed downward. They fired at Soviet tanks advancing among the ruins. Not a single tower was pierced by bombs or heavy enemy fire. In front of the Zoo Tower, the Russians tried to fire at the windows with their tanks, but the shells missed the upper floors. Where they hit, the explosions ripped through the unlined interior walls, and the concrete splinters killed indiscriminately. The surrounding areas of the towers were fortified at the last minute. Humboldthain and Friedrichshain continued to resist even after being completely isolated. The Zoo Tower did not surrender until the entirety of Berlin capitulated. Friedrichshain fell on April 30th, not so much due to a lack of ammunition, but because the Soviets in that sector were forcing civilians to advance ahead of them. It wasn't just a war of position, it was a war against any possibility of redemption. As the end drew near, the need to destroy everything arose. The orders were clear. No infrastructure was to fall into enemy hands. The Reich was to burn with its ruins. This was what Hitler had decreed on March 19th. His will was destruction. Factories, bridges, communication systems, depots, public buildings. Everything was to be razed if there was even a chance the enemy would use it. The army would be responsible for military objectives, and the party Gauleiters would handle the rest. It was the mandate of national suicide. But there were those even then who sought to preserve something. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, fought desperately to prevent absolute destruction. He argued that the bridges were not only necessary for troop movement, but that beneath them lay the water and sewage systems. If they were blown up, the entire city would be poisoned by its own waste. He succeeded in getting Hitler to exempt some key bridges. Even so, during the fighting, 120 of Berlin's 248 bridges were destroyed, and another 9 were severely damaged. Many of the viaducts were not blown up, not out of humanity, but simply due to a lack of explosives. The underground networks, the subway, the railway tunnels, became escape routes, ambushes, and refugees. It had been planned that, if necessary, they could be destroyed to block the enemy advance. And so it was. The Landwehr Canal tunnel was blown up and completely flooded. The tunnel under the Ebert Bridge was also destroyed, apparently by accident. Water began seeping into the entire underground network, spreading like a slow poison through the city centre. It is not known for certain how many drowned. Perhaps many, perhaps no one. But there is no doubt that, even if there were no floating corpses, the measure was just another of the desperate decisions that illustrated the moral collapse of the regime. The tunnel linking Bahnhof Zoo with Ruhleben was used by soldiers and civilians in search of an escape route to the west. For many, it was the last corridor before silence, and while everything was falling apart, the most basic thing was failing: communication. There was no military telephone network, there were no materials, no specialized personnel. Only a few operators were assigned to the commands. They relied on the civilian telephone network, which miraculously still worked between bombardments. The anti-aircraft artillery had its own relay system, but it was limited. The mail, although amazingly operational, could not be used to direct troops. There was no way to issue orders quickly. Reports from local units indicate that messages had to be sent by messengers. Sometimes carrying a piece of paper across a few blocks took hours. Young men running through rubble, through snipers, through enemy fire, for a piece of paper that might arrive late or never arrive at all. This breakdown in communications was one of the factors that precipitated chaos: conflicting orders, poorly distributed supplies, attacks launched without cover. Only the 56th Panzer Corps managed to maintain some coordination, thanks to the fact that it still had its own signal system. But for the rest, the war was darkness, isolation, and disorder. The last reserves are deployed. From the very beginning of the preparations, it had already been pointed out that the forces originally allocated to the defense of Berlin were completely insufficient. The need to bring troops from the front to protect such a vast city became apparent when it was already too late. Planned operations were forced to coexist with frantic improvisation. The organizational difficulties that arose were many and profound, reflected in a broken, erratic chain of command where confusion became permanent. This chaos made it difficult even to determine which units were actually present, and information about their strength was scarce, often non-existent. No unit was complete. Not a single post was fully staffed. What existed in Berlin was a hodgepodge of remnants, fragments of what had once been an army. In addition to the 56th Panzer Corps, forces were cobbled together from what remained in the city. Rank-and-file contingents, militia, alert units, young, old, wounded soldiers, deserters, untrained technicians and regular troops flown in at the last minute by train, truck, plane, or even on foot. Some never even arrived. Others passed through the city en route to more distant defense lines. Several were detained in the outskirts and never entered. Many simply continued westward, escaping the hell they knew was coming. In this maelstrom of movement and decomposition, the city also absorbed the spoils of units from the front. The names of the battalions that fought inside Berlin could fill pages, but they do not reflect their true strength. The designations were illusory. Behind them were not divisions, but decimated groups, sometimes composed of dozens of men, other times hundreds, without weapons, without morale, without food. The difference between the authorized figure and the actual number was abysmal, and even worse was the difference between physical existence and fighting valor. Even so, this portrait of the defenders of Berlin, although incomplete, provides a glimpse of the magnitude of the military collapse of a nation. At the beginning of February 1945, the Berlin Area Defense Staff was organized within the Wehrkreis 3 building on the Hohenzollern-Damm. Colonel Refuhr took over as Chief of Staff, accompanied by a handful of officers. Sprotter in operations, Weiss in supply, Platho as artillery commander, Fricker in communications, and Lobeck as chief engineer. On April 25th, as the Soviets approached the Hohenzollern-Damm, the group moved into the Bendlerstrasse bunker. Platho, for his part, had set up his command post in the Zoo Flak Tower, a symbol of a Berlin still firing with what remained of it. Of all the defensive elements, the Volkssturm was the most numerous and perhaps also the most tragic. Rehmann spoke of 92 battalions, 60,000 men, of whom 30 had been sent to forward positions, although many were dragged back to the city by the Soviet impetus. The Volkssturm, born in the fall of 1944 by order of the party and under the supervision of the Reich Defense Commissioner, did not formally belong to the army. Its original purpose was to act in the rear, to contain minor infiltrations, counter enemy landings, guard secondary lines, and participate in the construction of fortifications. But reality imposed itself violently. When the enemy set foot on German soil, this militia was pushed to the front. It was not prepared for that, neither physically, nor morally, nor tactically. The authorities never resolved its status, and Guderian failed in his attempt to integrate it into the army. In Berlin, the militia was divided into 2 groups. Volkssturm, I had some weapons. Volkssturm II, none. The idea was that the former would fight at the front, while the latter would support it in the rear as a relief force. This logic was followed in some sectors, but for the most part the Volkssturm was composed of older men, some over 60. Some had never carried a weapon. Others were veterans of the Great War who, driven by their sense of duty, still tried to fulfill their duty. The units were organized by neighborhood, by street. The men slept at home, worked in factories during the day, ate with their families, and at night prepared to die. Companies varied in number. A battalion could have 600 men or 1,500, depending on the neighborhood. Training was sparse, incidental. Some practiced in the evenings or on weekends if they weren't digging trenches. Basic rifle and machine gun use was taught, when weapons were available. Most never fired on a firing range. The officers were a mix of politicians and reservists. In one case, an officer demoted by Hitler ended up as a mere soldier under the command of an inexperienced bureaucrat. Their clothing was civilian clothes, adorned only with armbands. Their weapons were a patchwork of spoils, Czech, Italian, and Belgian rifles. Few units had German weapons. Often the ammunition didn't match the rifles. In some cases, 5 cartridges per man were issued. Others didn't even have ammunition. There were no means of communication, no field kitchens, and no vehicles. Outside their quarters, the Volkssturm men were left without food, without orders, without a destination. And yet some fought. Some resisted. Some died. Others, the majority, simply did not show up for combat. Some clear-headed commanders disbanded entire battalions. Where the Soviets advanced cautiously, Volkssturm units managed to delay the advance. But against a determined enemy, they were nothing more than cannon fodder. Alongside them in the city were the local defense forces made up of men unfit for the front. They had rifles, a few machine guns, and one mission: to guard bridges, stations, and prisoner-of-war camps. Some of these units were sent to the Oder in February. Others evacuated prisoners westward. Only a few fought in Berlin, to little effect. There were also military schools, technical training centers, courses for artillery officers. Many had already closed, and their personnel were sent to the southern front. In the surrounding areas, Zossen, Döberitz, Gatow, their remnants were used in combat, in hopeless actions. At the beginning of April, the Luftwaffe made replacement troops available for defense. There were many of them, but they were useless. They didn't know how to fight. They were assigned to secondary positions. Their military value was symbolic. Large factories and state institutions had their own protection units armed with rifles. They were organized into battalions and sent to the front. They were also of little use. The remainder of the Berlin garrison was filled with alert units, groups made up of convalescents, deserters, and isolated soldiers. The military police organized patrols to round up those who were still useful. They were poorly armed and lacked morale. Only through threats could they stay in line. In the final days, thousands of soldiers were found hiding in cellars. There, amidst the dust and fear, they waited for it all to end. Without comrades, without commanders, without identity, there was no war possible, and yet some still fought. The Waffen-SS, organized under the command of the SS Brigadeführer Munke, retained strength and morale. His main unit, composed of several thousand men, was stationed in the government district. They resisted as an elite with no future. The artillery commander, Lieutenant Colonel Plathow, arrived on March 19th to find only 7 light and 7 heavy batteries, all with foreign-made guns. He had 100 to 120 shells per battery. There were no vehicles or command units. 3 battery commanders were administrative clerks, not gunners. The crews were a hodgepodge of inexperienced soldiers from other branches. Communications with the observation posts were via lines connected to the flak towers, operated by female assistants. There were no radios. The first live fire exercise was interrupted. Shells fell on the command post itself. Still more batteries were improvised with training guns, operated by unqualified personnel. Some gunners were former searchlight operators who had never fired. There was barely enough ammunition for a couple of salvos. A few rocket launchers were positioned in strategic avenues, but each could fire only once. Anti-tank defense was a breeze. A battalion was formed with 3 companies, each with Volkswagen vehicles armed with 6 rockets. It is unknown whether they actually fought in Berlin or were diverted beforehand. The rest of the anti-tank defense was limited to the use of short-range weapons and anti-aircraft batteries, which desperately fired at the ground. The 1st Flak Division, under General Sidow, was one of the few organized forces. It had its command center in the Zoo Tower. It had 4 regiments, with 4 to 5 battalions each, equipped with 20mm and 128mm guns. Some batteries used old guns. There was a searchlight regiment scattered throughout the city. The 3 flak towers, Zoo, Friedrichshain, Humboldthain, were the defensive linchpin. Each tower had 6 128mm and 12 20mm guns on its terraces. They were well supplied. They were fortresses. They were linked by underground cables. Attempts were made to deploy other batteries around the city perimeter, but many were fixed, set in concrete. They couldn't move. They weren't trained to fire at the ground. On one occasion, a practice target missed even Lake Müggelsee. They were of little use. In many cases, they were immediately overwhelmed by Russian tanks. One unit with 2 battalions deployed around Tempelhof airfield held out for 2 days. Then, when they were overwhelmed, their tanks were blown up. The remnants of the crews fought on foot as improvised infantry. The Hitler Youth also fought. They acted as flak auxiliaries, as snipers, as infantry. Some were mustered into the Axeman Brigade, which fought in anti-tank operations in the east. They had rifles, Panzerfausts, and a fanatical faith. No one knows how many there were. In the west of the city, some fought under the direct command of the Reich youth leader, in the radio tower at Pickelsdorf. They held bridgeheads. They fought with enthusiasm. They died like children sent to kill tanks. And so, on the wreckage of the old army, the 56th Panzer Corps arrived, under General Weidling, on April 24th. It was the last organized force Berlin would see. It brought with it what remained of the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, reduced after the fighting on the Oder, the Müncheberg Panzer Division, reorganized at Döberitz and renamed, arrived with barely 20 tanks. It also brought the equally battered 18th Panzer Grenadier Division and the even less powerful SS Nordland Division, composed of Scandinavian volunteers. The corps also included the 408th People's Artillery Corps, 4 light batteries, 2 heavy batteries with Russian 152mm guns, and 1 of howitzers. But 60% of the pieces arrived without ammunition. Added to this were scattered remnants of other divisions, paratroopers, SS units, troops with no real fighting value. In the early days of the fighting, the Luftwaffe was still present. Planes flew over the city, 40, 50, 60 aircraft. They attacked on orders from the High Command. Then they disappeared. According to Chief Artillery Technician Schmidt's report, at the start of the fighting in Berlin, there were 3 large ammunition depots: the Martha Depot in Hasenheide Park, southern sector, the Mars Depot in Grunewald Park near the Teufelsee, western sector, and the Monaco Depot in Jungfernheide Park, northwest sector. These depots were at 80% capacity before the fighting. With the threat of a Russian advance from the north, 2/3 of the Monaco Depot's ammunition was moved to the Mars Depot by horse teams. However, the Mars and Martha depots fell into Russian hands on April 25th. Notably, the Defense Zone Artillery Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Platho, claimed to have no knowledge of these depots, suggesting a lack of coordination in defense planning. Despite the existence of these depots, troops reported chronic ammunition shortages during the Battle of Berlin, possibly because the stored ammunition was incompatible with the foreign-made weapons used by the Volkssturm and other local units. Furthermore, it is likely that these depots were closed to prevent ammunition from being diverted to other fronts, and that, shortly after the encirclement of the city and the entry of the LVI Panzer Corps with German weapons, the depots were captured by the enemy. This situation reflects incomplete and uncoordinated defensive planning. Dispersing numerous small depots in the city centre would have been more effective than concentrating 3 large ones in peripheral sectors. As for fuel, although exact figures are unavailable, its scarcity was evident. This forced the excavators to stop working and hampered motorized transport for the movement of troops and construction workers. In some cases, tanks had to be positioned in pits due to the lack of fuel. Regarding food supplies, in addition to civilian food stores, Berlin had well-stocked Wehrmacht ration depots. However, plans for the systematic distribution of these supplies were disrupted by rapidly developing events. A large Wehrmacht ration depot was located on the southern bank of the Teltow Canal, near Kleinmachnow, outside the outer defense ring. No measures were taken to move supplies from this depot or to ensure their rapid distribution. Even when the first Russian tank was just a few hundred meters away, the officer in charge of the depot refused to distribute rations to the Volkssturm troops on the northern bank of the canal due to the lack of a required issue certificate. At the last moment, the supplies were burned, their destruction having been carefully planned in advance. As a result, in many areas the troops lacked rations, while in others they supplied themselves from depots located in their assigned areas. The disruption to the public water system caused shortages in several areas during the fighting. However, troops were able to meet their needs by extracting water from wells and waterways in the city centre. The civilian population of Berlin at the time of the siege of the city is estimated at between 3 and 3.5 million people. The original population of 4.5 million had been reduced due to mass evacuations during the intensive bombing raids of 1943. However, many evacuees returned to Berlin when the Russians invaded the Reich, and numerous refugees from the eastern provinces were also stranded in the city. Early evacuation of the population was not considered in anticipation of the defense and possible siege of the city. People were encouraged to remain where they were, as it would have been impossible to gather everyone in one safe place. However, those who wished to leave on their own were allowed to do so, provided they were not bound by duties in offices, factories, or with the Volkssturm. To ensure food for the population, well-stocked warehouses were located throughout the city. Despite deliberate destruction by the Germans and damage caused by the fighting, there must have been a large food reserve at the time of the capitulation. Despite widespread looting by Russian troops and liberated foreign workers, it was possible for significant components of the Russian army, as well as the civilian population, to live for months on these reserves, although the population received only the bare essentials. Reports differ as to whether advance rations for several weeks were distributed to the population. Apparently, this measure was carried out in some parts of the city and not in others. Even during the fighting, long lines of people waited in front of food stores to buy rations. A particular problem was the feeding of approximately 120,000 babies in Berlin. When General Reimann questioned Hitler about this matter, he denied that there were any such children in the city, indicating his ignorance of the conditions in his own capital. Dr. Goebbels assured General Reimann that there was sufficient canned milk and that, in the event of a siege, dairy cows from the surrounding areas would be brought to Berlin. However, he was unable to answer how feed would be provided for the cows. However, these efforts proved insufficient compared to the scale of the urban collapse. As the bombing intensified and chaos spread, much of the population was forced to resort to improvised sources, public fountains, puddles, polluted canals for water. Scenes of mothers soaking cloths in murky water to quench their children's thirst, elderly people carrying buckets of water with their last remaining strength, and wounded soldiers drinking directly from the muddy ground amidst smoking rubble multiplied. Water, like food, became one of the cruelest weapons of war. The course of the fighting demonstrated that fighting an urban battle in a large, densely built-up city is a nightmare, even for an overwhelmingly superior attacker. As Stalingrad and Königsberg had demonstrated, Berlin also resisted, not with any chance, but with desperation, with bare fists, with the stubbornness of a doomed city. From this resistance, a series of tragic and painful lessons emerged as a warning for the future. First, it became clear that the defensive capacity of a large city depends not so much on specially prepared fortifications, but on the degree of destruction it has suffered. The more devastated a city is by fire and explosion, the more suitable it is for close combat. Second, the planning and direction of the defense must rest entirely with a single commander, one with full authority, without political interference, without double chains of command. All higher agencies that are not indispensable must evacuate the city before the fighting begins. Preparations must be made in advance, not in the throes of disaster. This includes building concrete fortifications, occupying key positions, and organizing the distribution of supplies. The defending forces must be composed of experienced combat troops. Lesser valued units cannot withstand the hell of house to house, street to street, and roof-to-roof combat. These troops must receive specific training in urban combat, infiltration, sniping, defense in depth, and ambushes in ruins. And there must be sufficient reserves to launch counterattacks and replace losses. The weapons that proved effective were those designed for close combat: grenade launchers, Panzerfaust, short-range automatic weapons, as well as anti-aircraft artillery used against ground targets, and assault guns used in counterattacks or anti-tank defense. A robust and reliable radio network was essential. The evacuation of the civilian population was necessary, although a sufficient number of workers had to be left behind to maintain vital functions, supplying, clearing debris, and operating workshops and factories. This segment of the population had to be subordinated to the military command and subject to constant psychological counseling. The psychological collapse became as lethal as shrapnel. An efficient military police force was also essential. Beyond the strategic decisions that led to the absurd sacrifice of Berlin on a purely tactical and technical level, the truth is that preparations were incomplete, incoherent, and marked by desperate improvisation. The root of this debacle was not only a lack of human and material resources, but a total absence of systematic organization, the fundamental requirement for any defensive planning that aims for any form of success. The hordes advanced from the east. Before the Soviet final offensive began, 1 Panzer Division and 4 Panzer Grenadier Divisions were in reserve behind the Oder front. These units had already been severely damaged in previous battles and had not been rehabilitated. 2 of them, the Nordland and Nederland, were composed mostly of foreign volunteers, which affected their cohesion. Between April 12th and 15th, the enemy expanded its bridgehead on both banks of the Kustrin in preparation for the final offensive against Berlin. Already at this early stage, it was necessary to commit the Müncheberg Panzer Division. On April 16th, the Soviets launched a massive offensive from Kustrin and the Neisse Line in the Forstgruben sector against Army Group Schöne's 4th Panzer Army. In the first hours of the attack, the Oder line held, but some units began to collapse. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Division was then deployed as reinforcements. During April 17th and 18th, the Soviets achieved deep penetrations. The German defenses began to crack. The arrival of reserves was fatally delayed. On April 18th, the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division was launched into the combat, followed on the 20th by the Nordland and parts of the Nederland. From then on, no more effective counterattacks were launched. The 56th Panzer Corps was only able to stem the enemy advance by a staggered withdrawal, fighting every street, every wood, every canal. The Soviet attacking wedge between Forst and Guben projected into open country, turning north, threatening the Ninth Army's rear and coming dangerously close to southern Berlin. To counter this threat, the German High Command improvised a unit still in formation, the Jahn Division, composed of members of the Labour Service. It was deployed along a 40-kilometer stretch around Baruth under the name of Armeegruppe Spree. On April 20th, the Soviets broke through this phantom line. They reached Zossen on the 21st and the southern ring of Berlin on the 22nd. Parts of the Jahn Division fell back toward Potsdam. Simultaneously, the southern wing of the Soviet 1st Army Group turned south and seized the Erkner Frankfurt-on-Oder line. The center advanced against the 56th Panzer Corps, which was pushed back toward Berlin. The northern wing met little resistance. It reached Wernöchen on the 21st, and the next day advanced via Bernau toward the Havel between Spandau and Oranienburg. When it was repulsed at Oranienburg, a panzer group crossed the Havel at Henningsdorf facing weak opposition. To protect the southern flank of the 3rd Panzer Army, which was still holding out on the lower Oder Army Group Vistula, had deployed some security forces, police battalions and Luftwaffe replacement units, along the Finow Canal to Oranienburg. On the 19th of April, a naval division began moving from Swinemünde toward Oranienburg, but because of the destruction of the railways, only 2 battalions arrived in time to repulse a Soviet attempt to cross the Havel. These forces were placed under Steiner's command. But south of Oranienburg, the Vistula Group had no means of bridging the gap to Spandau. It requested assistance from the High Command, which sent the so-called Müller Brigade, formed from bloodless battalions drawn from Döberitz. Whether this force reached the Havel or even held out for a few hours is uncertain. What is certain is that the Soviets crossed and succeeded in enveloping Berlin from the west. On April 22nd, Soviet troops advancing from the northeast reached the city perimeter near Weissensee and Pankow. Oder front was inevitable. The overwhelming Soviet numerical and material superiority, combined with the lack of German reserves with any real capacity, sealed Berlin's fate. Many German units fought valiantly, but others dissolved without a fight. Morale was already uneven, weapons were scarce, aviation was non-existent, and the new units were staffed by inexperienced soldiers. Hitler believed the attack would cross the Neisse toward Prague, but the coup de grace was aimed directly at Berlin. His decision to keep the Ninth Army on the Oder, ignoring the warnings of the Vistula Group, was a fatal error that led to the encirclement of the city and the destruction of the Ninth Army. The precautions taken at the Finnow Canal were successful but insufficient south of Oranienburg. The High Command failed to secure the western approaches, nor was it able to adequately reinforce the flanks. When the defenses collapsed, nothing remained but improvisation. The Soviet commanders, for their part, knew how to exploit the gaps. Their armored units boldly advanced north of Spandau, but the direct advance on Berlin was cautious and hesitant. They possibly overestimated the strength of the defense. The Vistula Group expected enemy tanks at the Chancellery by April 21st or 22nd. Commanders like Rommel or Patton would have attacked without hesitation. By April 22nd, Berlin was virtually defenseless against an attack from the south, northeast, or north. Along the 60 kilometers of the city's defensive ring, not counting the still unattacked western front, the lines were held almost exclusively by Volkssturm and other units of low military value. Only the heart of the city, the government district, remained protected by the SS. But even they knew they were holding out not for victory, but to buy time or to die with their boots on. On April 23rd, the Russians launched their final assault on Berlin from the south, east, and north. At several points, they broke through the German lines, and in the east, the first enemy detachments reached the inner defensive ring, halting briefly near the Friedrichshain flak tower. At the same time, Soviet units penetrated through Spandau, crossed the Havel, and took Döberitz that same day, Nauen on the 24th, and Rathenau on the 25th. By the evening of the 23rd, the Reich capital was completely cut off from the west. All the way to Potsdam, it was a closed ring. That same night, General Weidling assumed overall command of the city's defense and ordered the immediate deployment of troops from the 56th Panzer Corps. Its units were urgently deployed to the most critical sectors. The decimated remnants of the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division fought in the southwest. The Müncheberg Panzer Division was sent to the southeast. The SS Nordland and Nederland divisions held the eastern front, while the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division defended the north and south of the Zoo sector. This distribution, however, was nothing more than a fleeting photograph. Lines blurred, fronts blended, regiments evaporated hour by hour. Those divisions, already exhausted, remained as the last bastion of resistance, concentrating the desperate defense against the incessant Russian attacks, particularly intense from the east, southeast, and north. In the west, the attacks were smaller, though always disproportionately superior in men, firepower, and means. Enemy troops from the south, advancing behind the 1st Ukrainian Army Group, also had to divide their forces to face the German 9th Army, Potsdam, and then the approach of the 12th Army. The streets burned in fierce fighting. The German forces were slowly pushed back to the Ring Road and then beyond. By April 30th, only the government sector, the Tiergarten, and a narrow corridor to the Havel from the Zoo remained in German hands. The Russians launched a relentless and methodical offensive. Each attack was preceded by intense bombardment from heavy artillery, mortars, and aircraft. Then the infantry advanced with tanks, flamethrowers, and explosive charges. Berlin was taken house by house, street by street, basement by basement. Russian troops filtered in like shadows through backyards, subway tunnels, and sewers. Many defensive points were annihilated from below, from behind, from where no one expected. The overwhelmed defenders retreated from position to position, taking refuge in ruins, cellars, and destroyed buildings. The few operational tanks sought hidden corners among the rubble or were dug in as fixed fortresses after running out of fuel. The large air raid shelters and, above all, the flak towers served as the last bulwark. The artillery, deprived of suitable emplacements, finally massed in the open spaces of the Tiergarten, each gun firing tirelessly until exhaustion. The Russians also paid their price. The attrition was enormous. Their forces were rapidly depleted, and they had to constantly reinforce the front with new units. But they could do it. The Germans couldn't. The German lines were collapsing. In parallel, north of Berlin, with the Fino Canal falling and the threat of a Soviet offensive towards Hamburg, Army Group Vistula ordered Steiner to launch an attack south. Only 7 poorly armed battalions were assembled. On 24th April, they achieved an initial penetration of 10 kilometers, but when they encountered stronger Soviet units, they were pushed back to their starting point. The blow temporarily distracted the Russian forces but did not change the course of events. Hitler, however, saw in this slight advance an opportunity to liberate Berlin and ordered a major offensive on Spandau from west of Oranienburg. Keitel reinforced the order with his presence. The plan included bringing reinforcements from the Elbe, including the 28th Panzer Grenadier Division, but by 25th April, the Russians had broken through the line south of Stettin and the 3rd Panzer Army had to withdraw. The 25th Panzer Grenadier Division was rushed to support this withdrawal. The Holster Corps, which was due to arrive from the Elbe, was diverted to cover the Rhine Canal in the event of a Soviet attack on Hamburg. The dispute between Heinrici and Keitel became untenable. A furious Keitel accused Heinrici of treason and dismissed him on April 29th, but it was too late. The bulk of the German army would surrender to the west. The 9th Army, trapped in the middle of the Oder by Hitler's orders, was surrounded and encircled. On April 23rd, it was ordered to break out of the encirclement in the direction of Mariendorf and link up with the 12th Army to attack Berlin. It was impossible. General Busse opted for another route: escape westward through Halbe, protected by the woods. On April 29th and 30th, he succeeded. Some 30,000 men joined the 12th Army near Belitz. The 12th, for its part, under General Wenck, was at Magdeburg, facing west. On April 23rd, it was ordered to turn around, leave minimal rear guards on the Elbe and march toward Berlin. With only 3 divisions and many difficulties, Wenck reached Fersch and Belitz on April 28th, and there he was joined by remnants of the 9th Army and Reymann's troops who had fled from Potsdam. There was no time for more. The 12th had to return to the Elbe, where it was captured by the Americans. There was never a real chance of liberating the city. The orders to liberate Berlin were the starkest reflection of a total disconnect between political power and military reality. Issued from the Chancellery bunker by an increasingly isolated, paranoid, and pathologically stubborn Hitler, they demanded the impossible: that an army in ruins, without fuel, ammunition, or coordination, facing overwhelming Soviet numerical and material superiority, would miraculously reorganize to rescue a city that was already doomed. It was an absurd illusion without logistical or operational support, which only served to prolong the suffering of those still resisting among the rubble of a burning capital. Even so, those orders served an unexpected purpose: to breathe a last glimmer of hope into the men trapped in the Berlin nightmare. The promise of an offensive from the west, of a 12th Army turning back, crossing rivers and destroyed roads to burst into Berlin and break the Soviet encirclement, was perceived by many as a lifeline. Exhausted officers, ragged Volkssturm soldiers, Hitlerjugend children with Panzerfausts on their shoulders, all awaited this help like someone waiting for a miracle. People talked about Wenck in the makeshift trenches, in the subway tunnels, in the basements that served as field hospitals. The name echoed through the corridors of the Führerbunker, repeated by Hitler with messianic fervor. "Wenck will come," he said, but Wenck did not come. The truth is that the 12th, under the command of General der Panzertruppen, Walter Wenck, tried. He turned toward Berlin, abandoning the Western Front to the Americans. He crossed the Elbe, reorganized what little he had left, collected wounded and refugees, and advanced rapidly. He reached Belitz, just a few kilometers southwest of the capital. But there he stopped. The Soviet encirclement was now complete. The Berlin units were decimated. The roads were under fire. To continue would mean sending thousands of exhausted soldiers without air support to certain death. Wenck, lucid and humane, understood that he could not comply with that order and concentrated on rescuing what he could from the Ninth Army and the civilians trapped in Potsdam. After that, he turned west again and surrendered to the Americans. That was the final signal, when it became clear that there would be no rescue, that no one would break the siege, that the Western Allies would not advance from the Elbe, and that the enemy was meters from the political heart of the Reich. Hitler surrendered to the only act of will that remained to him: suicide. He did so on April 30th in his underground bunker, surrounded by ruins and shadows, alongside Eva Braun. It was the tragic outcome of a war he had started himself, which he now sustained only with hollow speeches, outdated maps, and fantasies of impossible counterattacks. The illusory orders to liberate Berlin, issued in the final throes of his regime, were nothing more than desperate echoes of a power that no longer existed. But they left, like all mirages, a trail of death among those who still believed in their promise. Following his death, General Weidling received a letter signed by Hitler at 1 p.m. on April 30th. It authorized a breakout attempt but forbade surrender. Weidling, knowing that a breakout through the Russian lines was not possible, ordered each unit to attempt a breakout on its own. But then Goebbels intervened, forbidding any breakout and announcing negotiations with the Soviets. Believing in an imminent truce, Weidling revoked his order that same afternoon. By May 1st, it became clear that there was no agreement. As the city lay dying, Weidling vacillated between breaking out of the encirclement or surrendering. He issued a new breakout order for the evening, but soon afterward reversed it. He summoned the commanders he could still locate to the Bendler bunker and informed them of his decision to capitulate the next day. An emissary took the offer of surrender to the Soviets. Independently, State Secretary Fritzsche had also made contact with the Russians. The two attempts were uncoordinated. Goebbels, seeing that his plan to be accepted as a minister in a new German government had failed, again ordered a fight to the bitter end. He then committed suicide. Chaos was complete. Some groups received no orders, others did, and contradictory ones. Troops from the Zoo sector fled through the subway tunnels and crossed the canal toward Ruhleben and the Havel. A group with tanks managed to cross the Spandau Bridge, but was annihilated. Only a few managed to escape. The majority were surrounded and captured north of Nauen in the open fields. On May 2nd, Berlin officially fell, but not without resistance. Some officers were accused of treason for announcing the surrender. There were threats of execution. Isolated units, especially the SS, continued fighting for hours, even days, until they were exterminated. The vast majority of the defenders fell prisoner to the Red Army that grey and final morning. Berlin, the proud capital of the Third Reich, surrendered in ashes.